"Sir, I'm going to need you to sit down." The flight attendant barely glanced at the weathered man in the worn jacket fumbling with his carry-on. No one offered to help as he struggled to lift it into the overhead bin, his hands trembling slightly. Just another invisible passenger in seat 12F, until 3 uniformed Air Force pilots stopped in the aisle, snapped to attention, and rendered a perfect salute that left the entire cabin in stunned silence. If that moment moved you, hit that like button and subscribe to Heroes Among Us for more stories that reveal the extraordinary individuals hiding in plain sight. These real-life moments remind us why sharing these stories matters. Michael Reeves clutched his boarding pass with calloused hands, the paper creased from his nervous fidgeting. Southwest Airlines Flight 2317 to San Diego would take 3 hours, but for Michael, this journey had begun years ago. The ticket had cost him nearly a week's worth of wages from the warehouse where he'd been working since his medical discharge, a bitter pill for a man who once commanded multi-million-dollar aircraft. 12F, middle seat, he muttered to himself. Of course it would be a middle seat. Nothing seemed to go his way lately. Michael navigated the narrow aisle, hyper-aware of impatient sighs behind him. His leg brace made him slower than the business travelers rushing to their destinations. At 43, he looked a decade older, his face weathered by years of high-altitude flights and, more recently, the sleepless nights that came with raising 8-year-old Emma alone after his wife's passing 2 years ago. When he reached row 12, a young woman in designer clothes barely looked up from her phone as he gestured to the middle seat. The businessman by the window continued his loud conversation, something about quarterly projections. Michael squeezed in, carefully arranging his small backpack beneath the seat. Inside was Emma's carefully wrapped birthday present, a model F-22 Raptor that had taken months to save for. "Sorry," he murmured when his elbow brushed the woman's arm. She shifted away without acknowledging him. The flight attendants moved through their safety demonstration while Michael stared at the ceiling vent, practicing the breathing techniques his therapist had suggested for his anxiety. Flying as a passenger remained deeply unsettling for someone who had spent thousands of hours in the cockpit. His right hand unconsciously performed the pre-flight check sequence that had once been as natural as breathing. After takeoff, the businessman continued his calls despite the flight attendant's repeated requests to switch to airplane mode. The woman beside Michael scrolled through social media, her screen brightness at maximum. Neither spoke to him or even looked his way. It was a familiar feeling, invisibility. Since returning to civilian life, he'd grown accustomed to it. Michael pulled out the small notebook where he jotted notes for Emma's upcoming science project. Teaching her about flight dynamics and aerospace engineering was one of the few moments when he still felt like himself, when being "Dad" connected to being "Phantom," the call sign he'd earned during his second deployment. As the drink service began, Michael's hands trembled slightly when he reached for the small plastic cup of water. A few drops spilled on his faded jeans. "Sir, do you need assistance?" the flight attendant asked, her voice carrying a hint of impatience. "No, ma'am. I'm fine," he answered quietly. The businessman rolled his eyes. Michael hadn't always been this way. Once, he'd commanded a cockpit with absolute confidence, making split-second decisions while flying at supersonic speeds. Now, ordering coffee at Starbucks could trigger his anxiety. The doctors called it PTSD coupled with adjustment disorder. Michael called it failing. Halfway through the flight, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a special announcement. We're honored to have 3 F-22 Raptor pilots from Edwards Air Force Base joining us on their way to San Diego for the air show tomorrow. They'll be moving through the cabin to stretch their legs. Please give them a warm welcome." Michael straightened instinctively, his military posture returning without conscious thought. He watched as 3 young officers in their service dress blues made their way down the aisle, stopping occasionally to chat with passengers or take photos with excited children. The lead pilot, a captain with sharp eyes, paused near row 10, speaking to an elderly veteran wearing a Korean War cap. Michael observed their interaction with a familiar ache. That world, his world, felt impossibly distant now. As the pilots continued down the aisle, Michael ducked his head and focused on his notebook. The last thing he wanted was awkward conversation that would highlight how far he'd fallen. But as they neared his row, something caught the captain's eye: Michael's notebook, open to a detailed sketch of an F-22 with flight vectors and thrust calculations in the margins. The captain slowed, then stopped. His companions nearly bumped into him. "Excuse me, sir," the captain said, addressing Michael directly. "Are you by chance Air Force?" Michael looked up, surprised to be noticed. "Yes." "Former." The captain studied him more carefully, then his eyes widened with recognition. "Wait, Phantom? Major Michael Reeves?" The businessman and the woman both turned to stare at Michael, their expressions shifting from disinterest to curiosity. "That's correct," Michael answered, his voice barely audible over the engine noise. The captain straightened immediately and rendered a perfect salute. The two lieutenants behind him followed suit. "Sir, it's an honor. You're the reason I fly Raptors." The cabin fell silent. Even the flight attendants paused their service cart. "I don't understand," Michael said, genuinely confused. "Operation Midnight Shield, 2017. You were lead pilot on the extraction mission that saved my brother's Special Forces team when their chopper went down in the mountains. He told me how you flew through conditions that grounded every other aircraft. You took fire and still didn't abort." Michael remembered that night: the storm, the malfunctioning instruments, the anti-aircraft fire lighting up the darkness. He'd never met the men he rescued. "I was just doing my job," Michael said, the standard response of someone uncomfortable with recognition. "Sir, with respect, you did the impossible that night. My brother has 3 kids now because of you." The captain turned to his companions. "This is Major Michael Phantom Reeves, gentlemen. His mission at Bagram is literally a case study at the academy now." The entire section of the plane was listening now. The woman beside Michael had put away her phone. The businessman had fallen silent. "What happened?" someone asked from across the aisle. The captain looked to Michael, seeking permission to continue. Michael gave a small nod, his throat tight. "Major Reeves flew his F-22 into a valley during a blizzard that had grounded all other aircraft, including the rescue helicopters. 8 Special Forces operators were stranded after their helicopter crashed. Enemy forces were closing in. He not only provided air support that held off the advancing hostiles but guided in a second extraction team through terrain that was considered unflyable. He took heavy damage to his aircraft but stayed on station until every man was accounted for." The captain's voice filled with emotion. "My brother said they'd all made peace with dying that night until they heard Major Reeves on the radio. His call sign, Phantom, came through the storm, and he said just 5 words: 'No one dies on my watch.'" Michael swallowed hard. He remembered those words, spoken in a moment of determination when command had ordered him to abort the mission. His career had never recovered from that insubordination, despite the successful rescue. "Sir," the captain continued, "would you mind joining us in the galley for a few minutes? We'd be honored to speak with you." As Michael stood, the businessman who had ignored him for hours quickly moved to help him with his leg brace. The woman who had avoided eye contact whispered, "Thank you for your service." In the galley, away from curious eyes, the captain explained how Michael's mission had inspired him through flight school. "They told us it couldn't be done, what you did that night. But knowing you did it anyway, that changed everything for me." Michael felt something crack open inside him, a sealed chamber of his heart where he'd stored away his pride, his sense of purpose. "I'm just a warehouse worker now," Michael admitted. "Couldn't pass the medical evaluations after my crash landing. Nerve damage." He gestured to his leg. "You're never just anything, sir," the youngest lieutenant said. "You're Phantom." When they returned to the cabin, passengers looked at Michael differently. A young mother asked if he would mind speaking to her son who dreamed of becoming a pilot. An older veteran nodded respectfully from across the aisle. The businessman offered his first-class seat, which Michael politely declined. As they began their descent into San Diego, Michael stared out the window at the scattered clouds below, thinking about Emma waiting at his sister's house. For her birthday dinner, he had planned to tell her edited stories about his military career, carefully avoiding the parts that gave him nightmares. Now, he wondered if perhaps he should tell her everything, including how sometimes doing the right thing comes with consequences, but remains worth doing anyway. When they landed, Michael found himself walking with the 3 pilots through the terminal. They insisted on carrying his bag and asked questions about his techniques for flying in zero visibility. For the first time in years, he felt the familiar rhythm of military camaraderie. Near baggage claim, a small crowd had gathered. Michael's sister stood there with Emma, holding a handmade sign, "Welcome home, Dad." Behind them stood several men, older now, bearded, but with the unmistakable bearing of Special Forces operators. "We heard Phantom was flying in today," one of them said, stepping forward. "Couldn't miss the chance to finally say thank you in person." Emma looked up at her father with wide eyes as the men who owed him their lives surrounded him. "Dad? Who are all these people?" Michael knelt down to her level, something that always caused him pain but that he never failed to do when speaking to his daughter. "Emma, remember how I told you everyone has a superpower? Something special they can do when it really matters?" He touched the model F-22 she clutched in her small hands. "These men helped me discover mine." The gathering moved to a nearby restaurant, where stories flowed as freely as laughter. Michael watched Emma absorbing everything, her eyes bright with a new understanding of her father. The pilots and Special Forces veterans treated him not as the broken man he sometimes saw in the mirror, but as the hero he had once been, and perhaps still was, in ways that mattered beyond the cockpit. Later that night, as he tucked Emma into bed at his sister's house, she asked, "Dad, why didn't you ever tell me you were famous?" Michael smiled. "I'm not famous, sweetheart. I just did my job the best I could." "That's what heroes always say in movies," she replied sleepily. As she drifted off, Michael realized something profound. The man in seat 12F, invisible, anxious, feeling worthless, wasn't his true self. That was just a shadow cast by loss and pain. His true self was still there, recognized by strangers even when he couldn't recognize himself. The next day, at the air show, the announcer's voice boomed across the field, "Ladies and gentlemen, the F-22 demonstration team would like to dedicate today's performance to a special guest, former Major Michael Phantom Reeves, whose courage and skill in the cockpit set the standard to which we all aspire." As the jets thundered overhead, Michael stood tall, his hand in Emma's, no longer invisible. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button and subscribe to Heroes Among Us. Your support helps us continue finding and sharing stories of extraordinary ordinary people walking among us every day. Remember, sometimes the person you overlook might be the hero someone else prays for. Until next time, keep your eyes open, heroes are everywhere.